Welcome, everybody. I am really tickled to death that how this conversation has been going. And thank you, everyone, for sending me emails with articles that you've been seeing over this past week. Now that I've made you more aware of social media and how it's affecting us, putting Google into that category as well. How many of you did the typology test? Oh, wonderful. So we will talk about that a little bit more in depth because I'm wondering if more of you had, my eyebrows went up about all the way up my forehead after I found the results for me. But I think you can all kind of guess how that type of research analysis goes. It's a segmentation model that does that. And it's based on a huge cohort, so I think that it's probably fairly accurate, although maybe their descriptions aren't as pleasing to us. Before I start, I'm wondering if anyone has comments about things that they thought of over this past week that you would like to talk more about before we get started.
Yeah, well, I left here last week feeling despair, and that's not an exaggeration, I was buying or saying hyperbole, because I thought, my golly, all this false information and how it carries so much further, with great intensity than factual information. Then a wonderful thing happened. As I just went into my usual routine of listening to favorite commentators on television, and I realized, my golly, we have superb journalists out there. And I love how subject matter experts are available. And so my despair lifted quite a bit, actually, and sustained.
Did you try going to some other sources as well as your normal sources?
No, and I should, but I am so
skeptical,
well, not skeptical, angry. And I don't feel like I'm getting information about those other sources. No, I just, and I'm embarrassed perhaps to say that, and it doesn't speak well of me.
It's a good segue because one of the things that I think I'm hoping everyone will leave the class with after that next session is the idea that we have no hope of coming together if we don't attempt to learn a little more about what the other side has to say and what their perspectives are. And we do, as we've seen and see today, we do have a tendency to follow the news channels. They call it the news diet of what we're used to and what we like and what is saying what we believe. But it's always useful and I think helpful to engage in conversations with other people and truly listen without setting it aside as, it's just baloney, I'm not gonna pay any attention. So, anyone else?
I really appreciated reading that 8th graders and above have difficulty evaluating information.
That was in our reading this week.
Right, that is true versus they can't tell what's true and what's made up, you know?
Yeah.
And last week I made a comment about a school stopped teaching something, and I really want to correct that because I really mean if subjects are deemed not to be important to be tested,
Yes, right.
then they don't get taught
Mhm.
because the teachers are always being evaluated on
Right.
what the scores are. So when I brought up the example last year of research being, because that's something that's not tested.
Mhm. You know, that's,
history too, right?
yes, and you know, and one of the things too that came out in the readings from the first session with the journalists talking about where things were going. It reminds me that the hope is that people will start paying more attention to local news versus just the national news. And to your point, that we need to get more people getting, running for the Board of Education or the school board, or, getting involved in some of the local political activities that can make a difference in our communities. Anyone else? Bob?
I've perhaps written as many as 2,300 sociopolitical commentaries, 15 or 16 years. And I routinely am asked to write for different groups, which I don't do. I think that kind of channels me in a way. And that kind of speaks to one of the topics at the end of the reading, which was the echo chambers. So if for example, if I'm just writing for a libertarian group, I'm just kind of reinforcing what they already know or believe, as opposed to, as Art and I were talking about before the class started, I typically try to pick subjects that people don't see in the news or perspectives that they don't see in the news. And I think that's important to be able to cross-pollinate this kind of ideas. The other thing that hit me really hard, I shouldn't say it that way, but that impressed me is that there was a segment in the reading that said that young people should be careful about what they put on social media because that will impact future employment opportunities, those kinds of things.
And you've seen that happen too,
And
haven't you?
there was a case at the Naval Academy. I was tangentially involved in this. Actually, I attended several of the federal court sessions via Zoom. And somebody made an accusation about a senior at the Naval Academy who was an exemplary midshipman. Exemplary. Top of his class. He finished all of his graduation requirements a year in advance. We sent him to the University of Maryland to get his graduate degree before he graduated from the Naval Academy with a Bachelor of Science degree. He didn't have a private pilot's license or an instrument license or an ATP. He had a commercial license as a 21-year-old. So, and he planned to become a Navy pilot. And there was some of his one of his classmates didn't like him for whatever reason and made an accusation, a horrible accusation about something about him. And the superintendent and the commandant moved to separate him from the Navy. It was ugly.
That went through the courts until the
And I
judge made
was
the
there
determination
listening
that.
to the court case.
that,
And it was
Even-
a classic case
It even had the
classic case
Secretary of Navy weighing
of
in,
McCarthyism
saying-
in today's society. And luckily, a federal court judge prevailed and allowed him to continue with his studies, got his master's degree. He's now in Pensacola, becoming a Navy fighter pilot. So, but those kinds of things, young people have got to be careful about what they put. I'm an old guy. I put stuff up on social media. I'm just waiting for somebody to try and cancel me at this point.
Well,
How about it?
But to that point though, we've also seen a lot of that going on in the media from different perspectives that are deemed inappropriate and getting canceled. And we'll especially be talking about that next week when we talk about the future and where it goes and that slippery slope of First Amendment versus people may have bureaucrats deciding or politicians deciding how to regulate social media. You said something that made me think, now I've forgotten what it was. Oh, well. Any other comments before I lose it? Rich?
One thing to talk about timing, perfect timing, just as the Olympics ended, Twitter announced that they had found 3,000 fake and bot accounts that were promoting China. Anytime someone said something bad about China, all of these, the people ones and the bots just started throwing comments to try and shut them down. So it's like they're talk about just listening to what someone says, and then you have these bots that are ramrodding information through. They're totally fake, they're not humans.
Well, you can barely open the paper or watch TV anymore without something about social media. So first of all, last week, we talked about how this happens and how our news is parsed out to us based on all these factors that we would never have guessed are happening in the background. This week, we're going to be talking about what the impact of that is, and how we define truth based on the information that's being fed to us, that as we learned about in the first session. And then next week, we will move on and talk about, okay, what are we going to do about this? So let me go ahead and share my screen. Which it didn't do, did it? It's right in there. Let me think here.
Did you click on share screen? Because I didn't see the mouse.
I clicked on
Share
share.
content.
On
So
share content. Well, let me try getting out of this and see.
While Lynn's looking for a fix, Art and I were talking before the class started, and I remember one of my mentors 5 decades ago talking about how Europeans were highly ideological, or always have been. If you take a look, I did a lecture a few years ago about third parties, and in Italy, they've got like 11 major parties and 24 minor parties. And so they're segmented in a lot of ways. And so they're very ideological. And what Phil Morgan said is that, at the time, Americans weren't very ideological. We were kind of plain Jane, down the middle, or at least we didn't talk about it. And then with the advent of social media, all of a sudden, we're finding that there are all these different grades of Democrats, all sorts of gradations of Republicans, and those sorts of things. And so,
yeah, I'm not so sure I agree. I think there were a lot of people who were considered quote unquote mainstream. There were also a significant number of people on the fringes. They had no voice. And social media gave them that voice. Not that they suddenly appeared, but now they're suddenly able to speak. So you always had, just use an example. There was always a Klan. The Klan was in more places than people wanted to even know. Klan was on Long Island. But they were, whatever, in areas they were supported, they had a voice. In areas that they weren't supported, they didn't exist. Social media gave you that opportunity to now say whatever you want to say, and everybody can listen, because now the distribution is so much wider. So I think that they existed. These groups existed in many ways. Have they gotten worse? I believe they've gotten worse, but now they have a voice, and to be able to say whatever they want to say.
and I think people are emboldened when they're not eyeball to eyeball with somebody. They can say stuff that they wouldn't say like companies.
So I can give you a good example of that. Okay, so prior to email, because email came before instant messaging. So let's just forget about instant messaging. Prior to email, you were careful about what you said. Okay, because I had to say it to you, Bob. Okay, telephones made that a little bit less so but your voice was there. Answering machines made it even less so because now you weren't there. Email changed the game completely. Suddenly, people could say whatever was on their mind, send it to somebody, and it was completely anonymous. Okay, anonymous in the sense that I have to face you when I was saying, and we saw that through my career, and we saw that, and that's what happened with emails. Messaging then got even more so because now, at least with emails, you might have written something and somewhere along the line, you might have gone, that may not be a good thing to go put out. Messaging was just like, hey, you're a jerk, you know, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't put that out, too late, you already did it, you know. It really has changed, email really changed the game a lot, because people, and then you got to the thing where, well, you're yelling at me. Why? How are you yelling at me in email? Oh, you're doing all caps, that's me that you're yelling. You know, all these things just started developing, which people tried personalizing when it may not have been personal, or on the other case, it really was personal and they just didn't, now they're seeing it in black and white, and it's, you know, it's so much more difficult when you write a terrible letter that you want to give to somebody, okay, as opposed to saying it to them. What you say to them may linger in their mind, but the letter is hard, and it's there forever, you know, and you can't get rid of it. You may be able to, you know, if you throw it away, that's one thing, but you can hold on to it. It was a very interesting dynamic, what happened when email came out.
It's interesting with Twitter, I don't follow Twitter. I used to up until a couple of years ago. I'd read it once a day. It would be an hour where I wouldn't be a whole hour, but it'd be time when I'd read it. And some of the monstrous stuff that's said on Twitter, it's just like, it's a hate infested platform.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, I always go by the same mantra, just because you can doesn't mean you should. You have the ability to do something, doesn't mean you really should do it, you know, they might not be the smartest thing in the world to do, but like I said, there's no question about it. Email just changed the world completely as to what was going on. And then all those other services came on after that, you know, after what was going on. In France, they started, one of the first real chats, real-time chat started in France by called, it was called Minitel.
Say again?
It was called Minitel, Minitel. And Minitel turned out to be the device. It's like a little computer, almost looked like a Surface, you know, you type onto it, you know. And it was, as Facebook started out, a dating app, a dating service. It was unbelievable what people would say on that to other people. I mean, it was just, and it was in France. It started growing, it came to the US at some point, but it was real time. And you just, whatever came off your fingers, that's what people would start saying. And it was incredible what would show up.
What year was this?
This was in early 80s. France started doing it. And the whole goal was that it was supposed to be the first segment of social media. Plus France was putting a lot of their town information on it. You know, they recognized what everybody else had eventually got. You know, you get spread out information to everybody in France. And they actually gave out the units. The government gave out the units. So here you go, it's in your house. You can have this, and you can have this. And all they needed to do is they connected to the telephone lines, you know, and did it that way. But it was, I don't know how. I mean, we got on it because we were trying to test it and see it was working. It's amazing things that were going on this site.
You know, the upside to email to me is that an old-fashioned handwritten thank you note, an old-fashioned handwritten condolence letter are all the more special and
More appreciated,
precious
yeah.
and meaningful and appreciated.
Yeah.
When I was still teaching, I would remind my students of that.
Right, it's true, that's true.
We talk about thanking very sometimes. He does remind me.
We exchanged that, and it's interesting that the tier one university candidates that I mentor, if I arrange for a day with a professor at Princeton or Naval Academy or something like that, I remember one time there's a really bright young fellow about 3 years ago, and said, after you finish with Dr. So-and-so, Professor so-and-so, you know, what are you going to communicate to this individual?
Bob, try and keep your voice going this way because they won't be able to hear you.
Okay. And so, so I asked this fellow, what do you, what do you communicate to this professor after you finish a whole day with him and the tour in the department and that sort of thing? And so he gave an idea, an outline of what he was going to. I said, and how will you convey it? And he says, I'll send him a text message. True story.
Yeah,
True story. I said, well, is there a better way you might be able to do that? And he, right away, he said, I'll tell you what, I'll put it in an email. And I said, so how many other
Wait,
people, there's one particular higher institution, higher education institution. So out of the 26,000 people that apply every year, how many people will send an email?
Okay,
And he gave an answer, hang on, and then I said, but if you wrote a handwritten note, a thank you card with their name embossed on the front, how many people out of 26,000, how many people do that? And he gave me the Rocky hand salute, I don't know, and I said, how about the limit approaching 0? If you want to be remembered, and maybe that professor will make a phone call over to the admissions department or admissions board, do you think that would be more memorable? And all the good ones, you can say, they do those. And kids are reluctant to do that. There was, I know with Rich and Lois, there was a fellow who sent them an email after they did something pretty extraordinary last year. And I kept bugging this kid, and he didn't do it, he didn't do it, and he didn't do it. And finally, after about 3 weeks, they got this lovely,
Wonderful script letter. It was a
From his
beautiful
mother?
script letter from a high school student. It's like, that is gorgeous. Handwriting, script and all of that. And we said, I don't know any high school kid that can write
High school
a
boy.
script, you know.
okay, so,
that was mom.
Yeah.
Mom was
so,
mom.
mom, yes, thank you, mom. So,
Exactly. It was
Dowdy,
mom.
can you see the screen I'm sharing now?
Yes,
Perfect,
Yes.
thank you. Sorry for the delay. There's always a hiccup with technology.
There's
And
always something out of the
finally,
sort.
we figured it out, but I'm not sure how we
They
figured it
did
out.
that so you could talk about it.
Yeah. So today, as I mentioned, we will be talking about the impact of social media on how we define the truth. And I want you to remember, because this conversation can stray wildly, Bob.
It's trying to fill some dead.
But, thank you. But the next session, we'll be talking about public policy choices. So if the discussion today starts veering in that direction, I'll humbly remind you to hang on to that thought until next week. So,
Does Jim want to say something?
I think it's just as fun.
You're muted,
Jim, you're
Jim.
on mute.
You're mute.
Let's see, yeah, you should be able to hit the little microphone button. It's still showing muted. Let me see if I can, oops,
there he goes.
That's
let
one,
me
that's
see
one
if
way
I
of doing it.
can, I might be
There
able
are
to
others.
unmute it.
This is so fun.
That was Jim. Now I can ask him to unmute and that might help. Okay,
Okay, now I see it. How about now? Can you hear me now?
yeah. There we can hear you. Did you want to make a comment?
No, I'm enjoying the dialogue though. But the only comment I was going to say in regard to something that was said earlier, I think by Bob, was I just feel very fortunate that nobody had cameras around when I was a young man on their phones to share. Whoops, it just muted again, I think. It
Ask you to
Can you
share
hear
your
me now?
video. No, we can hear you. I just asked you to share your video.
you're not okay, hold on.
Press start video.
Let me see. I don't see a press start video.
It should be right next to where that microphone was.
Or it could be on your bottom left, there would be start, you see
Uh,
audio and then there's video.
Here, I'm gonna send it to you again,
All right.
and then
it's
you
just-
should just respond to that.
There you go.
There you go. There you go.
There's that handsome
Okay.
guy.
Yeah.
Yep, now we can hear you.
All right. Yeah, no, what I was going to say was I just feel fortunate that none of my friends had phone cameras when I was a teenager, because I probably would not have gotten my security clearances.
That's probably true for many of us. So, today, what we'll be talking about before we watch the video and then continue the discussion is we'll be talking some more about those Pew Research typologies and how did you fit in. If you joined us a little bit later, I had asked if everyone had had a chance to do it, and most of us did, so that'll make for some interesting discussion. We'll look at, and then we'll look at those typologies and at how there are divisions that are created through those typologies. And then we'll look some more about how we get our news diet contributes to the polarization in this country. And finally, before we look at the video, we'll be defining echo chamber, filter bubble, and how these impact polarization, so that as we look at the video, you can keep that in mind. So these were the typologies that Pew came up with. Now, I do want to mention that from a 10,000, I think they had over 10,000 people more than that, who have taken this survey. And from that, what they are doing is they have done segmentation analysis and have created these categories. Well, and then they've put little names, they've done very short descriptions of each of those categories, which never really fit what you believe. But then they also included a longer description of your category as your responses cubbyholed you into. So I wanted to start with I'll start with myself. And there's no need for you to say what your typology was unless you don't mind. But I was surprised that mine put me where it was, because I consider myself kind of maybe a right-leaning moderate. And this put me far further on that path than I would have expected. So how about the rest of you? Were you surprised by your results, and how so? How did it not fit in your perception of yourself?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I find it interesting because it gave you basically and questions. Are you this, or,
Forcing
choices. So you would have choice A and B, and I would look at it and go, so where's C?
Yeah.
Because A and B don't fit.
And they said, just don't worry about it.
Don't worry about that.
That's
Okay.
right.
Right, so don't worry about that. So then when you chose either A or B, and I actually, what I want to do is I want to go back and I want to take it again.
I
Change
did that.
the answer
I
and see
did
what
that,
happens.
and it's kept the same typology.
Did it?
It
That's-
did.
I didn't think, I just thought about that now. I'll go back and do it. But it was just, I just kind of laughed. So mine came out as outsider left, young, not really, discontented Democrat, independent here, liberal. I'm like in the middle. If you want to ask me where I was leaning, probably leaned more to the left than to the right. So I just look at these things and we just love pigeonholing people, and you can bring it down to the nth degree, but if you don't ask really questions that allow people to explain themselves, I just,
Well, there's a reason why they don't.
Oh, yeah.
And it's too long for this discussion, but being a market researcher, I understand what they're
Yeah.
doing, but I also understand that unless people are really capable of reacting to segmentation results, there is really very little in my mind that is benefits from segmentation.
Yeah,
Because, and marketers will use it, and you can see how perhaps even the media is using it they'll use it to target certain audiences. And by segmenting, they'll find out that this group is the happy-go-lucky kind of people, and you're going to target this kind of a product to them, or they'll do all these machinations where I always think that listening to your customer is a lot better
right.
solution.
I mean, if I had to choose where I think I fall into this thing, it would be none of them, with the possibility of stress sideliners, except I don't have a low interest in politics. I have mixed political views, and I don't have a low interest in politics. I have a reasonably healthy interest in politics, but
Well-
that's not up there. So,
here's
so, okay, thank you very
Well,
much.
Bob Thompson is a good example where his, I think, actually kind of fit.
Well, again, like Art and Rich, I was looking for, libertarians, we're in the middle. I'm fiscally conservative beyond your imagination. When it comes to civil liberties, that sort of thing, I'm an ACLU guy. So where is that on there? They labeled me as an ambivalent right, and it's like,
Yeah, but the ambivalent
think
right,
so.
except for saying that you're young, it does say politically cross-pressured, and that is a pretty good description of a libertarian. And I remember in 2 elections ago thinking, oh, man, I really fit more with the libertarian in the sense that I'm financially I want a government that's financially responsible, but I also want a government that is socially responsible. And I sort of perceive that they've kind of put that ambivalent, right, sounds like a sort of a libertarian, and it's kind of in the middle. So it made sense to me. How about the rest of you? What were some of your thoughts?
What I didn't like art, I didn't like the answers. I didn't like A and I didn't like B.
But don't worry about it.
Do you like trade from other
Which
countries?
is,
Right.
yes,
Right.
yeah.
But, you
It
know,
makes me worry more when they say, don't worry about it.
Trust.
okay, you know, let's get everything from overseas and nothing inside the country. It's like, they were false comparisons in a sense, you
Okay.
know? It's like, I didn't really like either answer
Yeah,
that they were, so it's like, which one is less bad?
so
Right.
let's,
That's exactly what I did. But then I got caught and, you know, like less than, then came the follow-up question, I went, well, that's not good. Those follow-up questions aren't.
well, then let's look at this in a slightly different way. My first question, and it got answered, was what percent of the population fits into each of these categories? And I find that pretty interesting, and it makes sense. I also found it interesting that, you know, the data, this type of data is always weighted to actual demographic data within the country. So you know that on the right, where they have Republican leaning Republican or Democrat leaning Democrat, those are weighted scores based on the who they know is a Republican, who they know, people, the numbers that they are. But I found it interesting, for example, here, oh, it's interesting, my little arrow doesn't show up on the screen. If you look at the green, those are the stress sideliners. Those are the people who theoretically are the ones who kind of are, they're not paying much attention to politics. They're kind of somewhere in the middle. They're not really Democrat. They're not really Republican. Maybe they didn't even vote. So each side has a group of those. And each side has a small cohort from the other side. So when you look at how the people that we know are Democrats or leading Democrat in the way they describe themselves, some of those actually have are ambivalent rights. And for the people who said they are Republican leading Republican, there were actually some who fell into the Democrat categories.
Lynn,
Yeah,
one of the things I wanted to comment is that one of the studies I read about the differences in Republicans and Democrats tended to be more urban versus rural. And I didn't see anything, I haven't seen anything yet that talks to that. But,
well,
you know, when
it's-
when they show the maps of how the voting went throughout the country, you can see it just tends to be the counties that are more rural go Republican and the ones that are more urban go
yes,
Democrat.
that's very true. And I'm surprised they didn't map that out, but if they did, I didn't see it or I would have included it. But it's especially true when you look at, Pew has actually made some comments about the urban voters who tend towards the Democrat Party, and the same as what you're saying. So yes, that is true. Let's move on and see what the other slide was. Now, this one I thought was pretty interesting in the sense that what you see here is that the people that are on the top ends of these typologies, the top and bottom basically, are the ones who are most likely to vote and most likely to show support. So and that would include in social media, making comments about their party or getting involved in Facebook pages that are driven by their party. Well, on the other end, do you want to be able to see better? Wait, why don't you just park yourself over here?
Yeah,
It's-
I mean, I have to move over a little bit.
Yeah, you won't, no one's gonna see you. It won't show. That's right. Then down in the bottom where I made the circles on the right-hand side, those are people that are more towards the middle in the political stratum that who did. And they are the ones who tend not to get involved. Their political interest is lower and they are they are the ones who are not likely to discuss government politics nearly every day. So it was, you know, and I could easily have put those arrows up the top, but I also wanted to point out that that's a pretty distinct difference, I think. Now, these are gonna be hard to read, even on the big screen, dang it. So let me see if I can make it so I can read. Oh wait, I've got the slides here. On the well, of course, they're minuscule too. One of the things, the big thing here, the big takeaway on these typologies was how across all of the different issues that are tested in the longer survey. And I remember when that longer survey came out and I took that survey, and it was really long and it was in-depth. So it would have answered your questions because they weren't just either or
Right.
responses, they were ranges and, you know, and they were the broader categories. But on these, I thought it's very interesting how well their segmentation held up, with some exceptions. And those exceptions seem to come across more in the on the political right end of the spectrum, where you have outliers. And I've circled some of those outliers, whereas in the others, you can see where the two parties kind of hold together in their political thinking and they're content to do that. But then more than in the Democrat Party, you see more of the Republican side splitting off into two different directions, which I think we had a comment last week by somebody about how the Republican Party really needs to think about changing a little bit because they're not, they seem to not be meeting the expectations of a lot of their constituents. Me for one. So now remember
I
this
think
one,
it's true for both, actually.
it probably does go for both. Yeah, and I just read something about that, that was focused, it was somebody who was a Democrat talking about that with the Democrat Party. So I think that as we're about at the stage between national elections, where you would hope that the national party committees are starting to really think this through and figure out who they want to be when they grow up and who do they want as part of their party. Because right now, 40% of Americans are not of a party. So they're sitting, you know, they're independent, and there's a huge group of people that they have to be able to target at some point. So remember this from last week, we were talking about how news consumption skews now towards digital. So print is way down on the right-hand side, it's coming down. Television is still pretty high, probably because of the news like CNN and Fox and some of the different television stations that are more direct in terms of what people want to see. And then we also talked about this, how a growing share of Americans are now going to social media. I'm still confused over how in the world YouTube ends up with 80 1% of people using YouTube. But I have to remember, you have to remember that YouTube is also used to gain information. Like if you can't figure out what's wrong with your how to work your camera, you go on YouTube and somebody's done a YouTube video showing you how to do it.
But YouTube's also, a lot of the news programs
Mhm.
host their shows on YouTube.
And I believe you, I make great use of that because
Right,
I'll
and
see
so
a
I think that's
program and
where
I'll go to
YouTube
YouTube
comes
to
from,
see if I can capture it.
Right,
Yeah, so, and then we also found that last week, the Democrats were more likely than Republicans to use a number of platforms like Instagram and Twitter, although they were similar in the numbers that used Facebook. Now, in the reading that you had for this week, Pew talked about how we get our news. And in that, I don't know if anyone else was surprised by this, but it was equal numbers from either party, Republican or Democrat, who turned partisan news media bubbles. They go to the news they want to listen to, which is, and I think that's sort of where you were going too. And what I was encouraging us to maybe try and avoid that in the future, or at least mix it up a little bit. And then we tend to describe and as a result of that, we have a tendency to describe our views in more ideological, consistent ways. So if all we're hearing is a Republican view or a Democrat view, then that's probably how we're going to describe ourselves in the way we look at the world and think of ourselves politically. Now, Jim, I think you commented on this, sent a note to me, and funny, I think you should mention it. I already had that chart in here.
Oh, great.
It's you can probably see it at home better than we can see it, but the big thing here that is to look at the overall in terms of the number of media out there and how there's so many of them are segregated into skewing right or hyperpartisan right or skewing left or hyperpartisan left. Very little is left in the middle anymore. Now, the area that I would be most concerned about is when you get below that red dotted line into the items that are man, I wish I could make this screen stand out. No, I can't. That are less reliable, viewed as less reliable, more with misleading information. And Bob, can you read that? And on the left-hand side where they talk about reliability, news value and reliability. I was trying to read that. Under the red line, it contains misleading information and contains
Inaccurate, fabricated
fabricated.
information.
Yeah, so those would be the ones that we would definitely want to avoid. But it's the right and the left side of how the media bias chart puts some of these sources that show how divided we become by looking only on one side of that scale. Now, when you look at this more closely, like I would put ABC as skewing more left, and they are kind of over in that side of the middle. But you could look at ones that you know of and have visited or read, and you could probably disagree. But what I did want to share with you how the media bias people come up with this chart. And it's rather interesting.
Yes, that's a good question.
Yeah, because they have a team of over 40 paid analysts who rate individual articles, episodes, and shows of the different news sources. They make sure that those 40 paid analysts are politically balanced, left, right, and center, and come from a range of personal and professional backgrounds. I've actually seen a list of the backgrounds, and it is a pretty comprehensive, wide, and varied background of the people who are looking at all of these and
Can we
evaluating.
get copies of that?
Huh?
Can we get copies of that?
Yeah, sure, I'll include it in
And
the reading.
because it's, what's interesting is that just recently, I started reading the AP because I was getting tired of the skew. And I read about the history of the AP and all, and how basically their goal is, we are going to be fact-based, we're going to be as middle of the road as we possibly can. She said, oh, let me start reading some of the stuff in the AP. And it appears that they're true. Who's to the right of them in that square?
With the round circle?
Yeah, the round circle.
I'm not sure that.
I do know that Reuters is up there with
Reuters?
AP.
I know, right,
putting
no,
in some-
to the right of Reuters, to the right of Reuters.
Here,
Yes, yeah,
I can't read it.
yeah.
In terms, those are two mostly fact-based, but if you search on just media bias chart, this is constantly updated with, as news changes, and as their commentary and opinion,
And this is from last month.
Right.
So
Right.
it was updated January 22. So it's a far different one than I used last year, just as an example. So then, if you continue on that track of how we get our news, one of the things that we notice here is that,
Don.
Don? Oh, hey Don, did you have a comment?
I don't trust it. I don't trust the chart.
You do?
Yeah,
I
Can
do
you
not.
turn your, can you
does.
turn your volume up? Here, just.
He
let me
does
see.
not,
Oh, you do not trust it? Well,
Nope.
it's not. Yeah.
And I can tell you why.
Okay,
To put CBS and NBC in the middle and to put them as being fact-based, history doesn't prove that to be so.
you know, I would tend to agree with you on that, but you do notice that they are to the left of middle. So I
Well,
think,
I don't trust who put this chart together. Because historically, the New York Times, who is the paper of record, committed some of the worst atrocities in journalistic history. In World War II, they suppressed information about the Holocaust in Europe. They kept it secret or buried it on back pages, as did the Washington Post, and as did the LA Times. And they also, in 1933, they gave a Pulitzer Prize to Durante, who was almost a paid member of the Kremlin. And they gave him a Pulitzer Prize. And after they found out that there was genocide going on in 1933 in the Ukraine, where 6 million people died of famine, and they covered it up. And then later on in the 50s, New York Times owner, he admitted that it was true and that they had made a mistake and that it was the wrong thing to do. But all during World War II, they suppressed that information. And then, of course, we can't forget Dan Rathair with the George
geez.
Bush business.
so Don, one of the things that you're forgetting is that this is updated almost monthly. And so what they're doing is they're looking at how is the Times reporting news today? Not how did it report news 30 in the 30s or 50s or in the last election for that matter. But yes, that's a good point. But and this is.
It goes to the foundation that they stand on. The foundation that
They have a
stand on.
strong journalistic integrity compared to Fox News. I mean, Fox
Oh,
News,
crap.
you said that
Oh,
last time that Fox News was, something that the lady should listen to her husband, but they list their news as entertainment, and they're the ones who are getting sued for billions of dollars for disinformation.
And
The other ones have
and
got,
so is CNN, and CNN has had nothing but scandal for the last couple months, with this person being kicked out and that person being kicked out.
I know you want to talk about the
Yeah.
left. People could talk about the right too. It's just,
Yeah.
it's, there's nobody.
Mhm.
That's why I wanted to see what the chart was. There's nobody other than what I can see who skews somewhere in that middle that isn't, and everybody is guilty of somewhere along the line bias.
Right.
In left, right, center, they're all guilty of bias. You can complain about the Times, I get it. I can complain about the Wall Street Journal, it's owned by Murdoch. I know people who are in business who say, well, the Wall Street Journal is true.
And you can.
Why?
Right.
Why is it true?
And
It's the same thing.
And there are many, many reasons why you can have that kind of bias, but let's move on. And now you're it's really not about whether you trust that chart or not. When we talk about where we get our news, this is really our media diet. And this chart that Pew put together really highlights how segregated we've become in our news sourcing. For example, with the people who define themselves as Republicans, leaning Republican, almost all of them are getting, not all, I shouldn't say almost all of them, but a large percentage are getting their news from Fox, just as a large percentage of Democrats are getting their news from CNN. But I thought it was interesting that there were a lot more sources under the Democrat grouping of other sources that they go to for their news. And not so much on the Republican side.
I like what Art said earlier. There's, at this point in time, there appears to be very few places that are just putting out straight news. I think there used to be places that would be straight news, that's what it was, we're just gonna tell you the facts, you make up your own opinion, you know, the reporter didn't say, well, I think, you know, blah, 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 blah. I think that's a real problem. You look at that list of things, are there any of them that are saying straight news? No, which is, in my mind, a problem.
Yeah, and I think too, if you look above the fold, say on the New York Times, for example, too often we're seeing commentary there.
Oh, it is.
Instead of news.
Right.
And what I do, I look at, I don't look at that chart of all the news sources. But when I read an article, I often, if I'm unfamiliar with the source, I check them out. And then if I can, I check out who the author is. And I can put it in perspective. I can appreciate if I know where they're coming from. If there are subtle elements of propaganda that we see, let's say with broadcast news from ABC, NBC, CBS, I don't trust them as much as I trust places that I can go to and actually identify who they are, where they come from, and then I can balance that against my own perspectives or values.
Right. I mean, it's one of, just to pick up the Times, it is one of my big problems with the Times. It used to be, and I agree, they don't always report everything, okay? And, you know, and they leave things out and do that sort of thing. But at least at some point, it was news, and it was relatively easy to look at it and decide which were they reporting in their world facts versus opinion.
Yeah.
That is gone.
Yeah.
That is gone. I mean, I don't even read the opinion page except for to laugh, because I just like, okay, I know, you know, look, I can see that face of the picture. I know what you're going to say, you know. But in the Times, and with the Post, I mean, you know, it's just, which I think it's actually worse than the Times, but that's just my opinion. It is all opinion. The headline is an opinion, for crying out loud. The way they're writing it, I mean, you know, and they're there to attract people. You know,
So one thing that we can talk
yeah,
about
of
here.
course, that was my comment last week.
So one thing that we can talk about here is why does that happen? And we mentioned it last week. It's editors and advertisers who put pressure on the staff to present a certain angle. Now, that's not always true, you know, because for example, if you watch Good Morning America to wake up with your coffee, and you'll see body language and comments that are obviously personal comments, but that's not advertising. Good Morning America is not news, just like The Five on Fox is not news. These are people who are sharing opinions, and it's pretty much labeled as opinion. So one last couple last slides before we move on, we're getting late, is how how demographics play into these choices of media diets. And you'll see on one of them, there's a pretty large difference based on ethnicity and education and age. So when you look at these across the board, you'll see, for example, with age, that's primarily older for Republicans, going to only the sources that are right-leaning audiences. And it's a larger group in the Democrats that are going to all other sources that might be or might not be Democrat leaning. Then we go over here to education, and we see the biggest thing going on with the Democrats, where the highly educated are the ones that are going to only left-leaning audiences. And then a smaller group of less educated people that are, and a larger group of less educated people that are going to mixed sources. When we look at ethnicity, we've got primarily whites in both groups that are going to single sources. But what I thought was particularly interesting was how in the Democrat Party, we have people who are of color that are going to the other sources. They're not getting stuck on straight left-leaning audience news. We've talked about how social media is serving up a lot of the political news now. 18% are getting their news from social media at the moment. That was as of August 21. And now what we're finding is that when you look at these, for example, Facebook and Twitter, 53% say that they have, these are widely distrusted sources that they're going to.
But they do.
But they do. Yeah, well, whatever. And you have to wonder. But here's the example on Twitter. 7 in 10 US adults consume breaking news on Twitter. And 2/3 have at least some trust in the accuracy of the news when they're talking about breaking news. Yet, when you break that down by the political spectrum, you see that the Republicans are not so much trusting of the news that they're seeing, that the late breaking news on Twitter, and the Democrats are. Now, how do we get our news? We focusing back on that. Those who rely on social media or local TV for that matter are the ones who are far less knowledgeable about current events. And if you remember from some of the slides earlier and from last week, these tend to be the less educated people who are doing this, with the exception of some of the Facebook people. Most Americans think social media sites are censoring political viewpoints. That's especially true among Republicans or conservatives, a little less so for the moderates. And lastly, the politicians have gotten involved. And if you can read the small print on here, the politicians from each party are using distinctive language to more closely engage with their constituents. So what do? Look at the bottom right quadrant there for Republicans in 2020. 356% increase in engagement on Twitter and Facebook anytime they talked about the legal vote counted. With the Democrats, anytime they talked about Judge Barrett, 176% increase. So the politicians have become equally guilty now in terms of how they are sending out their news and dividing people even further.
I mean, I don't look at it that they're equally guilty. They've found a way, their goal is to remain in power. And they're found a way
Get the
to
message.
get their message out. They're marketing they're doing a wonderful job of marketing. I'm sorry, Lynn, but they're doing a wonderful job of
That's
marketing.
true too.
In the days of our republic, it was handbills, and now it's.
Well, it's right. I mean, now it's the distribution. It's how
Yeah.
widely they can get out
Lynn,
there.
your comment there?
Well, sort of. They have all those media outlets, and maybe I can't see it, but why isn't C-SPAN on there?
I was just going to ask the same thing, C-SPAN.
Well, maybe because there could be two reasons. One might be because
C-SPAN
they're,
is new,
I
and
love
C-SPAN
C-SPAN.
says it's balanced.
let me look here, where we have, okay, oh,
It's live.
It's not there.
yeah, it's not there. So there might,
Probably,
it's probably
I mean,
because
that
it's,
answers the question there on Vice News, they're just fact.
well, it's probably
So
such
we
a
don't wanna
small
have
end.
that.
It was probably such a small end that it didn't figure in. If it's less than one, they probably wouldn't have reported it. But, because I suspect that it's a pretty small group.
It's a
of people.
commentary on the source of this.
It really is, sure it is. So, echo chambers, before, don't go in, don't scare me up again. No. There, phew, that's what happened last time. So echo chambers, filter bubbles, and polarization. So we talked about echo chambers and filter bubbles a little bit last week, but you saw a lot more in the reading this time, especially if you managed to wade through a couple of those journal articles. But echo chambers are basically when people are talking to one another about politics and current events, but they're expressing only the opinions that they are seeing in their media bubble, right? So if you're only listening to Republican news, or if you're only listening to Fox, you're going to be talking, you're going to mirror what you're hearing on Fox, and vice versa, maybe with CNN. Another component of echo chambers is that you hear opinions that you generally agree with, and those that echo what you believe. So when you don't believe it, you have a tendency to either not pay attention or disregard it or move on to another discussion. Where you get filter bubbles is when you have two methods there. You have a filter bubble where the presenter is ideologically limited content that you made a deliberate choice to view. You know, you choose Fox versus CNN or vice versa, or you could have users that are having the information fed to them unbeknownst to them, as we learned about in session 1, where the algorithms are predicting what Facebook thinks you should be hearing.
Either
And-
pro or con, or they're
Correct.
not filtering.
Yeah.
They're preventing you from seeing anything that's contrary to what.
For example, if you dislike something, then they would probably say, oh, they don't want to see this. But if you share something or like something, you're going to get more of that. So we've talked about that. But what does that all come down to? It comes down to polarization. And I think you probably would agree with me as we've talked through this, that all of these things contribute to polarizing America today. It's not just the media, it's not just social media, it's us. We are polarizing ourselves. So now, let's go ahead and there we go. Except, what happened?
Nice picture of the Aurora Borealis.
No, they're not seeing it.
We lost the video.
No. We lost the ability to share it. So, I'm having a terrible time today, aren't I? Yeah. I'm just glad it's me and not somebody else that it's doing this to. All right, do this again. So let's keep the discussion going while I,
Okay, Bob, keep talking.
yeah, Bob, keep talking, Bob.
I was gonna make a comment about, how we silo ourselves. And part of it is the structure of a lot of particularly with social media as opposed to television, in that when you select the people that you follow on social media, you're selecting the people that share your same political ideology, values, beliefs, And
Right.
that then becomes what you're being fed. Is their exact same opinion matches yours?
Interestingly enough, I have this, I tell people about this all the time, and I'll make it the polite version of it. If I have to listen to your crap, you're gonna listen to mine. And if you're not willing to do that, then I'm not willing to have a conversation with you. I'm willing to talk about anything and everything. But
Right.
if I have to listen to you, you have to listen to me. And if you're not gonna do that, then I'm not gonna, then there's no point in engaging, because now we can't even have a reasonable discussion.
And in some ways that it's the aggressive way that it's approached that I think is divisive too.
Meaning what?
When you come in and just make very pointed, sharp comments, vote that facilitate aggression and or people being, it's like, wow. It's a social skill, if you will, to be able to discuss.
And we just might learn something from somebody else.
That's my point, yeah.
Yeah, I find it interesting when some of the people in the room have seen some of my editorials. They're full length, 400 to 800 word editorials, and I try to inject a fair amount of factual information. And then when people can't provide a salient counter perspective that's evidence-based, they hurl ad hominem like two monkey feces. It's amazing.
That's colorful.
You like that?
You writing that down?
I've written about that many times, but it's true. If you disagree with me ideologically on the construct of Article 2 of the Constitution, they'll come back and say, you're a racist. Or that, I'll say that federal FEMA assistance to Katrina victims was unconstitutional. You're a racist. It's like, no, read the Constitution. You're a racist. I mean, these other things. The interesting thing is I was on Occupy Democrats 2 nights ago, just reading some stuff, and it was interesting how these people come on and say the most ugly things about outsiders, about the people who normally contribute to that site. And I find that unacceptable. I really do. I never knew there was so many ugly things that people would say.
It's insensibility.
Incivility.
Well,
What were the three things when you're growing up, your parents told you not to talk about with someone?
politics.
Politics, religion,
And money.
and money. So we didn't want to bring those
And we've broken
subjects.
those edicts.
You can't go in and have those conversations, you will get thrown out.
Yeah.
You will, it's not allowed.
Jim?
Yeah, no, something I was going to say is that, I don't want to reignite any hard feelings, but when we were talking about like the bias chart, I think it also has to do with how much you believe in science or understand science and scientific, how it's derived by, and so I happen to believe strongly in science, and I think that also what's happened over time is my views of the world based on my own life experiences, living in other countries with other cultures, education. I've seen that, I've changed dramatically in my perspective. And I think that goes back somewhat to what we were talking about urban rural earlier. If you've lived 50 miles within your home, you might have a different view on, foreign affairs than you do if you've actually interacted. I'm not saying you're right or wrong. I'm just saying that, it does change your perspective.
It's an interesting concept, because when you think about it, how many of your high school pals have never moved away from home or more than 20 miles away from home? And so life experience does have an impact on how you view the world and how you view your role in the world.
I think it's far too common too in this country to have a very narrow or parochial view of the world. You know, look at our friends that we associate with or know from around the country, and how many of them can name the 9 provinces of Canada, our closest neighbor? We don't even know about that, you know. But you can go to Harrogate, England, and bump into a guy from Oslo, Norway, and he can tell you how the Chicago Cubs did during the last October. It's like, it's crazy. And Don has a comment?
Yeah, I want to echo what Jim said. I agree with him wholeheartedly. I'm sorry if I came off a little harsh there for a minute, but when you were talking about how people are so charged today, I am constantly bombarded on social media and on Facebook, because I had one political persuasion. 80% of the people on Facebook unfriended me. These are people that I've known all my life. You know, you're being called this and you're being called that. So I'm sorry, Jim, if I came along a little harsh there.
No, not
Well-
at all. Not at all. I think it's a healthy conversation to have.
But Don, just a question.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to come across that way. It's just that in perspective, like I know Fox News and CNN are always after each other, okay? But when you look at how many people watch Fox News, little teeny Fox News, only 3.5 million people. Compared to the New York Times or like
Largest
that, it's
news
really
is the
small.
largest organization in this country. It's not. That's not true.
They are.
Yeah, Fox, look at Fox.
You said
Fox,
they are.
they are.
Yeah.
They are. Fox News is the largest media organization in this country. Yes, I thought they were a minor example, and it is not. It is not. Look 'em up. They're a whole lot larger than you would think. First of all, you have to think of Murdoch. You have to think of Murdoch and Murdoch's influence, okay, of what he's got, okay, besides just Fox News and the Wall Street Journal and lots of other things. But Fox News itself is huge, absolutely huge.
That's nice.
Yeah. Now, if somebody finds that wrong, let me know. Seriously, but I think
You also have to look at the demographic that watches TV,
Mhm.
because young people who tend to be more liberal don't watch TV as much as baby boomers and the second generation. I don't know.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, because.
So I can tell you an interesting story about demographics. So this is the 2016 election. I lived in New York. My wife and I lived in New York at the time, and it's New York. I mean, yeah, it's mostly the area that we were in was mostly Republican, but there was some mixtures. And we were watching the debates and all these sort of things, and we just were starting to get this uneasy feeling, you know. And it was uneasy for me because I was not a Trump supporter. Okay, we just got this feeling that maybe this is going to go the other way. And we're talking to all of our friends, no, you know, in the community, no. And then we took a vacation and we went to Mackinac Island in Michigan. We walked away from that place and just went home and just said, we know who's gonna win. Oh, no, the night of the election. And when the results, we started getting phone calls. How do you know? I said, well, if you got your bodies out of the coasts and started thinking about what the rest of the country is thinking, you know, and all that, said, you would have found that out. I mean, it was like, there was no question in our mind what was going to happen. But it shows like you're in a different place, you're in a different location, you have different people around you, you know, that were people where we were just supporting each other, you know, but they were supporting each other in both groups, you know.
Right.
Okay, now let me see if this will work.
It's interesting how we become sometimes a product of where we are. I'll give you an example. My younger brother was a bit of an Archie Bunker of sorts, okay? And then he decided that, how do I say this thing? He won't be watching this tape. He decided he wanted to move from Norfolk, Virginia to Seattle to raise his family because it was racially homogenous, I'll be polite, right? And so he went from being an Archie Bunker, and 30 years later, he emerged as one of the, he became a polar opposite ideologically after listening to the news and reading the news in Seattle for 3 decades. And you can't talk to him these days. I can't have a conversation with him.
There you go. Right.
Because he's constantly lecturing at me. And it's like, it's okay, but it's like, we're having technical difficulties here from the executive producers.
Keep talking.
I'm gonna see if maybe, if I play this, you can hear it. No.
I can attest that Lynn spent hours splicing
Oh,
this video together.
Well, it's just the way it goes. Rich, do you know how I can get to the, oh, here, the sound. Where's the sound on this computer? I hate not being on my own computer. I'm sure you all can relate to that. I'm serious, Rich, do you know where the sound button is on this?
It's right here. It's goes there, 3.
Oh, it's right here.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
party
that's
function,
Wi-Fi.
it's party function buttons. They move them around in different locations.
Okay. Because I'm used to having it over in here someplace. Okay. I'm also used to having a touchscreen.
So I'll kill a little more time. So I was writing a piece on the political contributions of government employee labor unions work. And Richard wrote a piece about that probably back in 2009 or so. And it was full of a lot of data. So maybe 4, maybe 5 years ago, I went to write.
Okay, ready? I'm gonna play this. You won't be able to see the video, but I think you'll hear it.
Has documented a lot of this broad change that's occurred.
Let me start at the very beginning.
Can you hear it?
Yes, I can hear it.
Trust in America, in institutions, in each other is essential to the functioning of U.S. democracy. Yet today, trust is declining. So what impact does this have on American society? In this episode, Katerina Ava Matza and Lee Rainey help explain trust in the news media and how Americans evaluate news sources.
Trust is declining. Our work shows that people are less trustful of major institutions, including the news media, than they used to be. And your team has documented a lot of this broad change that's occurred.
The news media as an industry has undertaken a lot of changes. First, the way people get news today has changed from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago. We've seen that online news consumption is up, and it's at this point even more than television. Second is the news media industry's business model. We've seen that many news organizations are now changing their revenue streams, focusing now more on digital ad revenue. The third element has to do with
Ron, are you able to hear?
Yeah, we can hear it. Yep.
Okay, good. Okay.
political identity. We see that Republicans and Democrats place their loyalty and their trust in very different sources. The fourth development is misinformation. The challenges that Americans are facing parsing through the news online is in this new environment of misinformation, with a large share of Americans saying that made up news creates confusion, and it's really a big problem for society.
It's true that social media now has added an extra layer of complexity to the issues that news consumers and news producers are grappling with. And it almost gets back to the very foundational question. We ask, do you trust the news media? And a lot of people answer no to that question. But then to unpack that idea, and Americans are equally comfortable sort of saying, yes, I really like and I really trust some sources, but not others. And so in a way, their trust has become disaggregated and divided.
One of the things that we've seen is that idea of personal connection with a journalist or a news organization. We see that that matters. When we ask people whether their media represent them, whether the journalists that they talk to are embedded in the community, that's where we see big differences in how people evaluate the media. People that say that they've talked to a journalist or they see themselves in stories, they're going to have more positive evaluations of the news media.
People have lots of news sources that they trust, but they don't think that the institution of the news media and the industry of news organizations as a whole is trustworthy. So people tend to go to sources of information that map with their point of view. And we see in our data, Americans don't trust each other the way they used to. They don't think Americans share the same facts that they used to. And so the charge to people who are in the thick of this new environment is to figure out how to help people find their way to the truth and not make it a hard job.
Go to Google and type in climate change is. You're going to see different results depending on where you live. In certain cities, you're going to see it autocomplete with climate change is a hoax. In other cases, you're going to see climate change is causing the destruction of nature. And that's a function not of what the truth is about climate change, but about where you happen to be Googling from and the particular things that Google knows about your interests.
Even two friends who are so close to each other, who have almost the exact same set of friends, they think, I'm going to news feeds on Facebook, I'll see the exact same set of updates. But it's not like that at all. They see completely different worlds because they're based on these computers calculating what's perfect for each of them.
The way to think about it is it's 2.7 billion Truman shows. Each person has their own reality with their own facts.
Why do you think that Truman has never come close to discovering the true nature of his world until now?
We accept the reality of the world with which we're presented. It's as simple as that.
Over time, you have the false sense that everyone agrees with you because everyone in your news feed sounds just like you. And that once you're in that state, it turns out you're easily manipulated. The same way you would be manipulated by a magician. Magician shows you a card trick and says, pick a card, any card. What you don't realize was that they've done a setup. So you pick the card they want you to pick. And that's how Facebook works. Facebook sits there and says, hey, you pick your friends, you pick the links that you follow. But that's all nonsense. Just like the magician, Facebook is in charge of your newsfeed.
We all simply are operating on a different set of facts. When that happens at scale, you're no longer able to reckon with or even consume information that contradicts with that worldview that you've created. That means we aren't actually being objective, constructive individuals.
And then you look over at the other side, and you start to think, how can those people be so stupid? Look at all of this information that I'm constantly seeing. How are they not seeing that same information? And the answer is, they're not seeing that same information.
What are Republicans like?
People that don't have a clue.
The Democrat Party is a crime syndicate, not a real political party.
A huge new Pew Research Center study of 10,000 American adults finds us more divided than ever, with personal and political polarization at a 20-year high.
You have more than a third of Republicans saying the Democratic Party is a threat to the nation, more than a quarter of Democrats saying the same thing about the Republicans.
The use of data to make algorithms is inherently political. It becomes intertwined into this new field of technopolitics. And one of the biggest cases of this impact was the Cambridge Analytica scandal. For those of you who don't know what the Cambridge Analytica scandal is, Cambridge Analytica was an IT company accused of data breaching, harvesting, and manipulating Facebook users to swing their votes in favor of Trump during the 2016 elections. Now, this was a significant event because it showed how easy it can be for Facebook to harvest the data of millions of users to create sophisticated political profiles. Christopher Wiley, the man who created what can be deemed as a psychological warfare tool, was able to use these sophisticated profiles and target ads to work on your specific psychological makeup. In this, there's a trade-off between the integrity of the story and persuasive content. And though this didn't work to change any deeply held or pre-existing beliefs, it did work to amplify anxieties and resentments and create divides in social groups, as well as echo chambers. So hypothetically, if I was a liberal and I went online, I would keep seeing liberal skewed posts. I wouldn't get to see the other side of the story. I would have fallen into what we call an echo chamber. Now, this is really common in the physical realm, where people tend to adopt the viewpoints of their family members or those they're physically close to. But now, it's happening online, in a place that was deemed democratic, and everyone's voices appeared equal. So if I keep seeing liberal skewed posts, I'll become polarized to liberal methodologies. Now, this isn't to say that all algorithms or filter bubbles are bad. Sure, they can reduce information overload, personalize your search feed, and even predict dangers that might affect you. But this is to say that there's a trade-off between the integrity of the story and personalized content. And once again, if you're missing one piece of the story, you have a completely different narrative.
But what you consider real and fake in many cases has become a question of where you're sitting and who you're listening to. In our Sunday Spotlight, NBC's Hallie Jackson goes inside the increasingly polarized American media culture that has us talking past each other.
Network Television's first daily half-hour news program.
Back then, there were 3.
Sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours.
Before breaking the news down to the views that we choose.
I don't know how we have a conversation with each other when we're not speaking the same language.
Is this an impossible choice?
For professional organizer Michaela Santin in progressive Portland,
it's 2:20.
It's NPR in the car.
Support for OPB comes from our members.
On her phone, Facebook. Her evenings, network news.
Most reporting nowadays would fail Journalism 101. It's so clear the media hates Donald Trump.
John Barry used to be part of the media in Redlands, California. He still starts his day this way.
I'll still read the LA Times, sometimes just for laughs, but it's getting so outrageous that they'll even put anti-Trump stories on its sports page.
But the self-described Twitter addict,
great to have you, Rush Limbaugh here with
now runs on the right.
The only political show my liberal wife and I can agree on is Morning Joe. But the rule is when Joe is not there, then I get to turn it over to Fox and Friends. So.
Is this the right deal for Democratic senators?
I would not watch Fox News because it would drive me insane. And it would make me angry.
Today, so many choices, but many reflecting a single point of view. Easier than ever now to limit the ones we listen to, often leaving us in so-called echo chambers.
We are just not listening to each other at all because there are so many choices. It's like pick your own adventure, pick your own news.
And that is what Eli Pariser calls the filter bubble.
We live in kind of our own personal information universe that's been curated by websites like Facebook and Twitter based on who they think we are and what they think we'll want to know.
He points to 57 indicators that Google uses, for example, to sort what you see, based on everything from where you're sitting to what browser you're on. That could keep you inside your own news universe.
In a society that depends on everybody kind of having a sense of what's going on for the greater whole, that becomes a real problem.
And that is something both sides agree on.
It's hard to unify the country, though, with the news media being so split up. When I was president, you mattered a lot more.
Increasingly, we become so secure in our bubbles that we start accepting only information, whether it's true or not, that fits our opinions.
But in truth, it began
I did not have
under another president.
The Drudge Report is a media gossip page known for below-the-beltway reporting, and it's gaining a reputation as a growing irritant to the White House. You are, you admit, a conservative, and you have increasingly targeted the Clinton White House.
Well, I go where the stink is.
The Democrats and their fear-mongering.
What was once relegated to talk radio exploded on TV. The launch of Fox News in 1996, taking it to another level, fighting against what was perceived as a liberal bias in the media.
He's the guy that's on your side.
I'm on your side.
You said you were on my side.
No, you got us confused.
But when administrations changed, the pendulum swung the other way.
I accuse you, Mr. Bush, of lying this country into war.
Today, even more tangled with the web. The result, what can feel like permanent polarization.
Oh, it's very easy to slip in that echo chamber. I mean, I've lost friends on Facebook, but right now we're just talking past each other. We're wired differently, we want to hear different things.
All right, so folks online, this recording is going to stop here in less than a minute. So I wanted to thank you and to apologize that I don't know what the heck happened to the technology, but at least we were able to listen to it. Those of us in the room, we can finish listening to it and have a little bit of discussion about it. But again, I apologize that this didn't get up earlier in the session like it was supposed to. So I don't even know why this other thing is showing up on the screen. I don't know where it's coming from. Literally do not know where it's coming from.
Coming from Norway.
Yeah, but it's not coming from this computer, so I don't know what it's doing. So yes, we've been taken over.